Im Klang. Der Podcast vom Hören.
Ganz einfach geflogen.
Willkommen zur 11. Ausgabe von Im Klang. Im Klang entdeckt mit euch die Sphären der klingenden Welt und der Hörerfahrung. Wie wirken Klänge auf uns? Was erzählt uns die vibrierende Luft um uns herum? Und was kann uns das Lauschen lehren? Jeden Monat sprechen wir mit einem Gast, der oder die uns spannende Einblicke in verschiedenste auditive Themen geben kann.
The sound, however it magically works, the vibrating air hitting the bones in the drum, translates into something.
Sind Klänge innerliche oder äußerliche Phänomene? Dieses Mal begegnen wir einem US-Amerikaner, der persönlich und sehr gründlich das Verhältnis von Hörerfahrung und Geist zu ergründen versucht. Mit dem Autor, Lektor und Dharma-Lehrer David Schneider spreche ich über hysterische, religiöse Ausdrücke, die einmalige Lautsphäre eines Zen-Klosters und Buddhas Lehre des Transzendenten Hörens. Im Anschluss an unser Gespräch wird David Schneider eine seiner Kurzgeschichten lesen. In Induction reflektiert er auf sehr amüsante Weise seine ersten Versuche, das Hören und die spirituelle Praxis zusammenzubringen.
My name is David Schneider. I'm an American living in Cologne. So if people ask what work I do, I say that I'm a writer and a teacher. And both of those subjects are connected to Buddhism, which I've been practicing since 1971 in the Zen style, and then after that in the closely related meditative schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and also in certain lay traditions, Shambhala lay tradition. And I work as a teacher and as a writer and editor, although mostly I'm retired from active editing, but I still teach and I still write. And I do calligraphy as well.
What do you hear right now, David?
What do I hear right now? Yeah, there's some light thumping sound coming from either by the radiator or right outside. Like maybe water moving through the pipes slowly. I hear Molly's paws, the pads of her feet, and also her nails on the wood floor. Molly the dog. The whirring of the computer. Those are the main sounds.
Are there any sounds that you specifically like more than others, David?
I think the general category would be moving water, the sounds of water moving, like in a stream, with water going down a brook and hitting the rocks, or even by a big river like the Rhine, sometimes by the shore, the sound of the water coming up and going back out. In the ocean, the sound of crashing waves. And then very specifically, I like a couple of kinds of specialized water sounds. I think my favorite sound is if it's begun to snow at the beginning of the winter, the first snow, and it's really kind of clean and pure, and it makes everything look white. And then more snow lands on the already fallen snow. And it's a very soft, fine, distinct sound. It's very calming. And it might be connected also to the fact that everything looks white and everything is still and there's not much traffic, but usually you can hear the snow hitting the other snow. The closest sound to it is another strange water sound. It has to do with, like in a bath, if you have bubbles and the water is still, you're not adding water anymore, and the bubbles are there and they begin slowly to pop. Very slight little popping sound. And that's close. It's similar to the sound of the snow falling on other snow.
As we want to talk about sounds and listening and hearing in your life today, and your experience with conscious listening and spirituality or Buddhist practice, Let's start in your childhood.
Yes, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on religion in our house. So in terms of lineage, my father was raised Jewish, and my mother was raised Southern Baptist. It's a particular kind of Christianity that tends toward the extreme. It's fundamentalist, they would call it.
I was once a sinner, but I came, pardon to receive from my Lord.
And so that particular way of practicing Christianity is very connected to music. There's a lot of singing, and there's a lot of hymns. The thing had to do with being loud. There would be a lot of singing. The preaching was loud.
Also in the white tradition. We know this screaming Baptist.
Yes.
You know, while I'm busy trying to please myself, you know what God saved me for? To please Him. You know what God saved me for? You know what God brought me out of this world for? To live for Him, to praise Him, to honor Him. Hallelujah. You know why I'm here tonight? To worship Him. Hallelujah tonight.
And they would encourage people to get up and have spiritual experiences in front of the congregation.
How would that sound like?
Hysteria.
Come here, Baptist preacher. Oh my God. Oh my God. Turn around and look at these people. What?
From the Lord. I got what I wanted from the Lord. I'll go back to Washington. Oh, yes, I will. I'm a Southern Baptist. They don't believe in tongues. But God said it. I want it.
And once in a while, somebody might go into what they call tongues. When they get with, speaking in tongues, it's called in English. It's when you depart the realm of words and you're just making sounds, gobbledygook sounds. And that's supposed to be the Spirit speaking through you or something.
Hold him up. Shout hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Now that loud, let that Holy Ghost language come up out of you. Do it now.
I find it kind of creepy. Also in the Jewish tradition, I mean, again, a great deal of it was vocalizing. My experience of Jewish upbringing was something called Saturday school. You went on Saturday mornings and learned about the Jewish religion, the history, the language, Hebrew. I didn't study it much. I liked the calligraphy. It's very beautiful calligraphically. And I know some of the prayers. You learned them, you memorized them. And they're spoken out loud on the holidays. It's a very oral tradition. And I went into the choir, and so we sang a lot of hymns again. So my religious upbringing, I would say, was mostly connected to music.
So you're practicing meditation on a regular basis since almost 50 years?
51 by now.
Before we talk further about sound and listening in your life, I guess we need to know, what is Buddhist meditation about?
Meditation in the Buddhist tradition goes back to the Buddha himself, who, in his quest to overcome suffering, he saw that the world was suffering and he was suffering, and he wanted to put an end to that. And he tried lots of different kinds of spiritual traditions. He went and studied with various teachers and did a number of different practices himself. But finally, he settled on the practice of meditation as the most effective way of getting at the question of suffering. His earliest teachings are about how to overcome suffering, and he recommends meditation, specifically what he called mindfulness. One of his earliest teachings that we can attribute to him is called the Satipatthana Sutra. It's the foundations of mindfulness, and it's how you practice meditation. And it basically means you pay attention to your experience. And he specifically said you should pay attention to 4 parts of it. You should pay attention to your body and your feelings. You should pay attention to the quality of your mind and also the contents of that mind.
What is quality?
The quality is like, is it a heavy mind? Is it a depressed mind? Is it excited? Is it generally cheerful? And that's a little different from what are the specific thoughts. So the focus of Buddhist meditation is to be aware of those things, to put your attention on those things. And that is basically the same thing as listening to those things. Listening, it turns out, is one of the very best ways, one of the most direct ways to be present with your experience.
Listening to your mind?
Yes.
To the thoughts of your mind?
Also, listening to your breath, listening to your body.
Feeling the breath, listening.
All of those things.
What is meditation good for?
Well, it's good for helping you understand your life. And people come to it when they don't understand their lives, when they run into problems and they don't know how they got there. Why did this happen to me? Why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? I'm feeling bad, usually. Suffering is a widely shared general experience. And so the Buddha said, well, pay attention. Look at it. Look at how you got there. And the way to find the answer to that is to look at your experience now. So if you want to know, how you got where you are, start where you are. And the roots of what's happening in the future are to be found here. Also, where you are now is a result of things that you did in the past. So pay attention to now and you'll understand those things. If you decide to practice meditation, it's very helpful. It's a great support to have other people to do it with you. So since the beginning, people have found that it's good to practice meditation together. When you do something like that together, you need to coordinate. You need a beginning to your meditation period. You need to know when it's over. You need to call people together for meditation. You need to make various signals. And depending on how many people there are, you could do that with your voice. But tradition from early on has been to do it with what we would call musical instruments, a bell or a block of wood being struck by another piece of wood, or a kind of a drum. Early sort of primitive musicality has been useful in the meditation tradition.
In order to
coordinate.
Keep structure.
And to keep structure for a group. Also, there are many other effects that it has when you hear a bell. For example, it interrupts your discursive mind. It's almost impossible to think for a couple seconds when a bell is hit. It stops whatever the train of thought was, and you're presented with a fresh, open moment, which we generally recreate discursive mind very quickly. But the fact that there's an interruption possible and a gap or a pause, that's considered a hint that mind has both. It's not only discursive, it also has the possibility of space. So discursive thoughts are not just tightly linked one to another. They're floating, you could say. There's room in between them. And sound, particularly bells or abrupt sounds like a block or a clack of wood, create those gaps. Now, I should probably say here that according to Buddhist philosophy, which is part of the Buddhist teachings, the sense organs are considered mind. And so sense perceptions are not thought of as different than thoughts. It's a little different than in the West. In fact, all of the five senses are considered aspects of mind. And the discursive mind is very busy working with the sense perceptions to create concepts so that you know, okay, it's white and it has a particular shape, it's cold, and your mind puts those together and later gives it a name called milk. That's just an example, but we're doing that constantly, hundreds of times per second. That meaning comes later, after the raw perception of the sound, however it magically works, the vibrating air hitting the bones and the drum, and then that translates into something. It doesn't stay raw.
It really means that a central perception is part of mind.
Yeah.
Buddhists understand every noise as a sound which we make.
Zen master Suzuki Roshi, who was one of the first to teach Zen practice in the US in the 1960s, explains it very clearly as follows.
You may say the bird is singing there, over there. But we think, bird. When we hear the bird is me, already. Actually, I am not listening to bird. Bird is here, in my mind already. And I am singing with bird. Pee, pee, pee.
Yeah, Suzuki Roshi. Yeah, no, and that's right. Bird is not separate from you. Bird is in your mind. It's like a sword coming through you. The sword is outside you and it goes through you. You're penetrated by it. So you can't say it's outside, but you can't say it's only inside.
Because other people hear it too.
It was caused by something, but your perception of it is continuous. If it wasn't possible for it to be inside you, you wouldn't know it. There's some stimulus, but it goes in, wherever in is.
Reciting, singing, and music seems to be part of all religious practices.
I mean, if you break it down, it's natural that would be so because, basic experience, again, this is according to Buddhist psychology, is body, speech, and mind. And so you use all three of those to create your experience. If you accept that those three sort of rough categories of human experience, body, speech, and mind, they're useful in terms of understanding how we got where we are and how we're creating where we're going. If you accept those, then of course speech in the middle is crucial, and it links those two. It links body and thought. And so it would be used consciously by every tradition that was interested in working with those aspects.
If the own voice has an effect on the own body-mind system.
Definitely.
So the other way around, if you chant or sing, it triggers thoughts, the mind?
It has a complete effect, yes, of course. Your mind might feel very still, for example, in meditation. But if you say a few words to a friend, you might notice that hundreds of other words are rising up in your mind because you opened your mouth and started to say things. And then that changes your entire experience.
So the other way around, if you practice silence, which you do during meditation, what kind of effect does that have?
Yeah, well, speaking has an effect and not speaking has an effect. In general, as you have pointed out, in temple life, in contemplative life, there is an emphasis on silence. I think it's not really because silence is better than noise, but that in order to hear sound, in order to hear clearly, it's extremely helpful to have a background against which you can hear. So if you want to pay attention to the sounds you're making, either vocally or with your movement or with your activity, if you want to hear that, if you want to tune into what kind of effect you're having sonically, it's interesting as a background to assume silence. Silence is extremely useful as one end of a spectrum. And against that background, you can hear better. You can hear words better. You can hear the teachings better. For example, if your own mind isn't busy, you can actually hear what another person is saying. In Zen, it goes all throughout the day. The whole idea is to have a completely mindful life.
I wonder about the extreme noise in modern city life.
Yeah.
Which result does that have to a spiritual practice?
It's not easy, which is frequently why meditation places are found in the country. I have a feeling that there is so much sense information coming at us all the time through all of our senses, not just the hearing, that mostly we tune things out. We have very reduced experience. Also, I think we have reduced experience of what we can hear.
As David lived in a Zen monastery in California for a couple of years, he can tell us about the sonic environment of a Zen monastery.
Generally, the day began with a wake-up bell. We used, in the monastery that I lived in, we used like a hand bell. Yeah, and then they would ring it loudly and run, generally. So it was one of the times you made noise. You would clomp around and ring the bell. That was at 3:40. And then at 3:45, there would be what was called the han, which was the sound of a thick wooden block. I don't know how many centimeters that is, but maybe 4 or 5 inches thick, being hit in the middle by a wooden hammer. And it's a sharp, knocking sound, and it's hit in a very particular pattern. So it was hit in a pattern of 7 minutes, 5 minutes, and 3 minutes, at the end of which would be a roll down, so and then once. And that was called the end of the first round. It's almost impossible in a meditation center to do anything else when the sound of that thing is going, because even though it's going once a minute, you're listening for it all the time because you don't want to be late. Because if you're late, you're not allowed in. And then a series of bells would start, exactly in the same rhythm. And these bells, these were different size bells, usually very large, hanging bells. They were struck from outside, and they would be hit, again, in a particular pattern to indicate the hour. Oh, I forgot to mention the big drum that would be hit together with the big bell as the big period began. A big, really big, a taiko drum. Boom! And then you hear bong, boom, bong. It was a wonderful concert, really. So while you were sitting inside the meditation hall, outside this big bell would be sounding. And inside, other bells would be sounding to say, begin meditation. So it's this constant concert of bells and blocks and different bells indicating different things. And then there would be what we would call a service, or a period of chanting together, in which you would chant Buddhist texts, basically. So that just takes you up through the morning. It's already a hugely intense series of sounds. So it's quite intense sonically.
You wrote this beautiful story about sound and listening that we will hear later in this podcast, and it talks about the practice of transcendental hearing.
Hearing, yeah.
What is transcendental hearing?
I don't know. Honestly, I wish I knew. I mean, that's what this transcendental hearing appears in the Surangama text, in this sutra. It's a text in which the Buddha asks his senior disciples, what is the best way to attain enlightenment? What do you think? What's your experience? And so each of the senior disciples, the enlightenment beings, they're called, they come and present some method. So it's the structure of the sutra is one after another of these presentations on good ways to attain enlightenment. At the end, a bodhisattva called Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva stands up and says, well, actually the best way is listening or hearing. And he describes the practice of transcendental hearing. And then the Buddha asks another of his disciples and says, well, he just said that, what do you think? He goes, I think he's right. I think that's the best one. And so disciple number 1 and disciple number 2 agree about hearing or listening or transcendental hearing. And there is not really a clear description of how you do that in the sutra. They go on and on about the virtues of it. There's quite a lot, but it's not like A, B, C, D, you do this, that, the other thing. It's sort of more obliquely described. So I got busy with this practice at one point because it was early in my career as someone trying to practice, and I thought, well, if this is the best way, and if disciple number 1 and disciple number 2 agree that listening or hearing is the best way, I should try that. And so, so I tried. And I'm still trying to figure out what the answer is. It's an interesting question. And in the Zen world, to work with a question is considered practice. It's how you practice. And so transcendental hearing is a spiritual question. Vasudeva said, it is as I thought. The river has spoken to you. It is your friend as well. It speaks to you as well. That is good. That is very good. Stay with me, Siddhartha, my friend. I thank you, said Siddhartha. I thank you and accept. And I also thank you for this, Vasudeva, for listening to me so well. These people are rare who know how to listen. And I did not meet a single one who knew it as well as you did. I will also learn in this respect from you. You will learn it, spoke Vasudeva, but not from me. The river has taught me to listen. You will learn it as well. It knows everything, the river. Everything can be learned from it. See, you've already learned from this water too, that it is good to strive downwards, to sink, to seek depths.
In your short story, you're also talking about Hermann Hesse Siddhartha, who finds enlightenment by listening to a river.
Yeah, it wasn't clear exactly what he was listening to, but he was listening by the river, and he was hearing all these brilliant teachings in the river. But was the river, or was the river his mind, or what was he hearing?
Yeah, maybe he was hearing the present moment.
The present moment isn't necessarily quick. Sometimes it opens up and stops. We've had that experience. I think everybody's had that experience where a moment suddenly gets very slow and long and open. Yeah, the reason I thought about that book was because that was one of the books that was around that people were reading in the late 60s, in America anyway, in the kind of edges of the contemplative scene. It was considered a cool book. It had a picture of the Buddha on the cover, and it wasn't long, and it was a nice story, and it was in English. It was a wonderful book. I loved it. In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was one, and the Word was God. The first line of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, is in the beginning, there was the Word. It was of interest to me that it was a word. It was something you could hear. And I mean, maybe I don't know what the actual Greek word or the Hebrew word they used was. That's how it came across in English. In the beginning, there was the Word. How is it in German?
Am Anfang war das Wort.
The idea was it was something you could hear. And if you wanted to know about the beginning, well, you had to hear the word. So it was an encouragement to practice listening. And also in the Hindu tradition, there are many practices about nad, and I think it's N-A-D, a sound, an inner sound. And many of the designs of the yantric designs of mandalas and so forth are thought to be physical representations, visual representations of the vibrations of a sound. If you had a drum surface and sand on it, and if you made a particular sound at that drum, the grains would resolve themselves into a particular pattern, reflecting the waves of that sound. And so that was then extended into the fact that the whole world arises from these vibrations taking physical form. And I think that it's not only among certain branches of Hinduism that teaching is given. I mean, I think American Indians also had something similar with their chanting and their sand paintings and so forth. I don't know a lot about all of those things, but they were supports to me who was kind of floating in this big ocean of Buddhist teachings for, some orientation that listening was a good way to go about it. So I put in the story a couple of the places I was looking to get support.
Could there be a relation to the sense of listening being the first developed sense in the womb?
Is that true? Again, I've heard that. I heard also that it's the last sense to go when you die, that you have to be careful around a dying person not to talk as if they weren't there or say bad things, because even if they can't do anything else, they can still hear. And that's the last sense, apparently, to go. And so there are texts that are spoken to the dead in various traditions, Egyptian and also Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist.
What is said in these texts?
Instructions, how to go forward, what to do when you're confronted with various experiences. So how do you relate to that? The Bardo Todo, it's called, the instructions for going across the Bardo.
Mit dieser Aufnahme vom Kehren einer Straße verabschiede ich mich von David Schneider und seinen Klang-Geist-Recherchen. Okay, danke David.
My pleasure. Thank you for the good questions.
Wir hören gleich noch, wie angekündigt, Davids amüsante Kurzgeschichte zum Thema Transcendental Listening. Und wir machen jetzt eine Winterpause. Die nächste Ausgabe von Im Klang erscheint am 1. Februar. Ich freue mich, wenn ihr Im Klang liked, abonniert und weiterempfehlt. Und wir freuen uns wie immer über gute Ideen, Vorschläge und Kommentare. Ich bin Marilyn Jansen und wünsche euch bis zum nächsten Mal alles Liebe und jetzt noch viel Spaß mit Tensho David Schneiders Kurzgeschichte.
Induction, a short story by David Schneider. The letter said yes, I could move there, but it would be a couple months before a room opened up. Newly dropped out of college, staying with my folks back in the family house, I looked around for what other training opportunities might be available. I needed somewhere to go. That's how I ended up across the state on a rural property outside Philadelphia in an old, crumbling, farmed-turned meditation center. Until this point, all my experience in this realm had been with the Japanese Zen lineages, some Rinzai and some Soto. These differed from one another in noticeable ways. The length of the meditation periods, for example, their frequency, the names of the meditation hall roles, the style and content of the interviews with the teacher. But they were also part of a family. One could see the differences because the styles were so similar. The head teachers were for the most part older Japanese men. A new student like me might be guided to interact mostly with Western disciples, but the head teacher was from the old country, where he had made his mark. In the place I landed, the teacher was a Westerner, I'd guess about 50, with a sturdy body, a shaven head, and big black frame glasses. We did a lot of physical work during the days, and he often worked alongside us. You could say he was burly. Cleaned up, and in the meditation hall he sat like a statue, most impressive in his gray robes. The Japanese Zen teachers I'd seen before wore robes of black or brown, but here standard issue was light gray. We chanted liturgies in monosyllabic Korean. Not understanding the monosyllabic Japanese I had chanted before, this was not much different. We went along at a nice clip, accompanied by the crisp talks of a leather-covered mallet rapping on a hollow piece of wood in the form of a fat fish. This too was familiar. What was new was melody. There wasn't much of it, and as far as I could tell, it was only used in one sutra, but it existed. At the name of one of the interlocutors in the text, we would almost pause. Following this slight rhythmic hitch, we would chant 3 ascending tones and go along at that plateau for a while. Then we would repeatedly slide up a couple steps before dropping back, like a skiff bouncing over waves. It began again with a little hitch, the 3-note figure, the plateau. Described like this in words, it could be Gregorian chant. But there was nothing mournful here, nothing pleading, no background passion of the Christ. This tune was cheerful. It even felt slightly playful. Your mind might wander, little boy, if we just drone one note, so come on, follow me. La dee da 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 dee dum 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 dee dum 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 dum. La dee da 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 da. I have to say I loved it, and very much looked forward to the chanting. The other melody arose at Reveille. For this, the teacher walked around the stone barn where we slept, and as he did, he chanted. I wasn't sure if it was the same Heart Sutra we would recite later, or if it was another text. He kept time by clacking together 2 hardwood dowels. These produced a strange, sandy sound out there, a percussive beat that came closer to the barn, circumambulated it, and retreated. It sounded different on the four sides of the building. Maybe a Doppler effect? Or perhaps it had to do with the way his voice wound around the beats. It might also have been that I was still partly dreaming, just coming out of sleep. In any case, it was beautiful, not at all a bad way to be awakened. We had 20 minutes to get to the toilet, the bathroom, and back into the barn where, on the main floor, we sat in the meditation hall. I've been writing we, but for most of the 10 days I was there, only one other student followed the schedule all day, a big brown-haired fellow with freckles who told me to call him Kelly. He stood about a head taller than I did and was bulky like the teacher, though muscular in a way that probably had to do with his youth. I wasn't sure if Kelly was his first name or his family name, but I was glad he seemed to like me. He could have been a menacing bully. He could have played flanker on the Irish rugby team, to tell the truth. But mostly he just acted like a guide, someone who showed me around and tried to orient me. "Here, Dave, we all try to finish eating at the same time," he said, walking back to the barn after breakfast the first morning. I knew that. I had just gotten caught out with a piece of toast. I'd assumed the others were going to have seconds too, since they had consumed their enormous first portions with enviable speed. Kelly, the teacher, and his wife, she joined us for meals, all ate very quickly. So I had to sit there, munching alone, and to my ear loudly, as they waited for me to swallow and conclude the meal. "Thanks, I know. I just misjudged." "You got to watch that, Dave." "What is that stuff in the bowl on the table?" "In the middle, that's called kimchi. It's a hot, sour cabbage pickle." "At breakfast?" "It's always there." Kelly and I bunked in a loft that ran on the inside of the walls of the barn, with real square footage at two opposing ends. My mattress lay in a curtained-off section in one of these spacious ends, together with 3 other mattresses. Evidently, I was in the dorm. Kelly was also down here, but he had a much sturdier room, with framed-in sheetrock walls and a low bed. He had sheets and blankets. He had tricked out his space with a bedside table, some bamboo mats on the floor, and an armchair with a standing lamp next to it. A low 3-drawer dresser and some hooks on the inside of his door accommodated his clothes. The property had been newly acquired, a fixer-upper in farmland, reachable for the last stretch only by unpaved road. We got dirty during work period, and we needed at least 2 changes of outfit, including whatever we wore to the meditation hall. Kelly and the teacher wore robes in there. People joined us for work days and for the talks by the teacher. Whenever either of these things happened, the visitors would also stay for a meal. Everyone else seemed to know about the kimchi. They took liberal amounts on their plates and into their bowls. For the first several days, I didn't know how to address the teacher. In the literature they'd mailed, he was called Reverend Gilbert. But as with Kelly, it was unclear to me if that was a first name or a family name. Kelly told me to call the teacher. Well, it sounded to me like he said, sing-song. Because of the chanting and the wake-up melody, I could remember this. Later, I saw it written in transliterated Korean, and it contained many more vowels than I had imagined. Sing-Song and his Korean wife seemed to have known Kelly a long time. He was clearly the senior student. He might have been the only student, but it felt like he could just have been a nephew from out of town or an exchange visitor from the university. One morning after breakfast, they told me they were all going to town for errands and had also planned to have lunch with one of the local parishioners. They wouldn't be back until late afternoon. Did I mind being alone, holding the fort? I did not. Sing-Song's wife, I never got her name, showed me the laundry area and told me there were leftovers marked in the fridge. I waved to them as they left, started a wash, straightened my little living space, and raided the refrigerator. After that, I settled down in a sunny place for some study. In early 1972, only a few texts of Buddhism or on Buddhism had been widely published in English. It was possible to have read most of them. I hadn't yet, but I was working on it. At the time, I was going through a compilation called A Buddhist Bible. This book gathered material from a wide variety of sources and languages: Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, and others. I'd gotten to the section in a somewhat controversial sutra in which a variety of awakened disciples come forth and describe the best way to enlightenment. The topic was of strong personal interest. In the text, the Buddha tells 25 enlightened members of his assembly, the highest bodhisattvas, that he is worried about his cousin, Ananda. Ananda has gotten into some hot water, it seems, vis-a-vis his vows, and the best thing would be if Ananda could become enlightened. What do they think is the best way to do this? It appears the Buddha is asking for help. A reader spies from outside the pages as the 25 conspire with the Buddha to develop a plan. Methods are put forth. Experiences are recounted. One after another, the bodhisattvas rise from their seats, together with their many followers, bow to the Buddha, and say their piece. Finally, the bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, who is also distinguished with the title Mahasattva, or Great Being, and is considered, if not the highest of the bodhisattvas, then with none higher, rises, bows, and tells about the practice of transcendental hearing. As with many of the stories, Avalokiteshvara's begins with a memory of spiritual practice from an eon incalculably long ago, when he began his quest for enlightenment. Introduced to the practice of transcendental hearing by a Buddha of that time, he practiced it and attained a series of exalted states. In case a reader did not recognize their exaltedness, a Buddhist Bible capitalized their names: entering the stream, emptiness of mind, enlightenment, nirvana, transcendental consciousness, essential, mysterious, enlightening mind, great heart compassion of all the Buddhas. Sublimely uplifting as it is, this story also mystifies because it contains no instructions on how to actually practice transcendental hearing, which seem to be both different to and inseparable from ordinary hearing. Most confusing, and this happens early on, the practice of transcendental hearing is suddenly to be discarded. Following a line of asterisks in the text, however, an ellipsis of some sort, it reappears and leads to the attainment of the diamond samadhi. This absorption, in turn, gives rise to compassionate magical powers, which Avalokiteshvara enumerates and describes. The ones beyond description he hints at. To a young, spiritually hungry seeker, or more accurately, to a young, spiritually horny seeker, desperately sublimating, these descriptions felt like unbearable foreplay. I too wanted to practice transcendental hearing, enter the diamond samadhi, and attain the 4 kinds of inconceivable, wonderful transcendencies of spontaneity. There were also the 14 kinds of fearlessness of powers of deliverance to think about. With these, I could certainly clean up my life, nay, also the lives of others. I was totally turned on. I was practically transcendentally, spiritually erect. The next thing presented in the book, again after a row of asterisks signaling skip material, is that the Buddha turns to his right-hand bodhisattva, Manjushri, and says, "You've heard everyone. What do you think?" And Manjushri, the Prince of Dharma, the embodiment of wisdom, after pages of astonishing summary, replies, "What Avalokiteshvara says, that's the best. I've practiced it too, and of all the methods, it's the most expedient." So, there it was, the enlightenment being of compassion and the enlightenment being of wisdom, both teaching that the surest, wisest, most feasible technique was hearing, or listening, or something. I read and reread these sections for practical advice. Manjushri seemed to be saying that the descent of transcendental hearing was beyond personal will or agency. A novice could not just practice regular old hearing and hope that it would turn into transcendental hearing. But a little further on, he seemed to be saying that indeed a person could do that a novice just had to stay with it. He took up a number of topics: how to hear sound with the fleshly ear and not be disturbed, the necessity of distinguishing outer sound, inner sound, the sound of one's mind. There was a section on how to reverse outward perception and listen inwardly for the perfectly united and intrinsic sound of one's own mind essence. But there was little I could understand. How did you do this? What do you listen to? It did seem that somewhere here lay the path. This accorded well with another touchstone of spiritual wisdom for seekers in the late 1960s, Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha. In that book, a Buddha-like hero, after a long journey, finally seats himself by a river and attains enlightenment by listening. To the running water? To his mind? To the interpenetration of these two? Maybe listening meant something else entirely, like when Manjushri says, "Ananda, listen to me." For the rest of the day, though, going to the kitchen, snacking, coming back, and for the next several days, what I really chewed on was the question of how one engages in hearing, much less transcendental hearing. Where did one focus it? Close in? Or was it better to let it loose and open up panoramically? If so, to how much detail? Where does an outer sound become an inner one? And what is inner? Are we talking about waves in air causing tiny drums in the ears to vibrate? Where do those vibrations go? How are they registered? By what? What, again, is meant by the mind? It was possible to obsess about these things, and I certainly did. I remember one evening, after getting back to my parents' place, tripping out on sounds my keys made, the rattling of one against another, their clicking into a lock, the clunk of the tumblers in there, a deep crunching sound of the door as it opened. I spaced out so profoundly that I forgot to get out of the way of the woman who stood there behind me, patiently waiting for me to pull the door open and let her into the car. This wasn't a purely invented fascination of mine. There was textual support for it too, especially if one's reading oozed over the borders of canonical Buddhism. Not that the sutra where I had gotten this hearing business was accepted by everyone as canonical. At the end of the chapter I had been reading, even the compiler of a Buddhist Bible, Dwight Goddard, admits, "From now on, the literary style changes from the convincing, rational character it has had and becomes more or less superstitious, irrational, unconvincing, and to us of a more scientific age," he wrote this around 1930, "useless for our present purpose of winning by its spiritual power followers for Lord Buddha." Dwight Goddard then goes on to tell us what of the remaining text he plans not to translate, almost all of it, with exceptions for a few little parts he likes. Canonical or not, incomplete, questionable as to heritage, the Shurangama Sutra was still presented as a Buddhist text. But if one followed leads into the classical Hindu territory, there was a great deal more about sacred sound, letter, word, and the utterance of the universe into manifestation. In this barely post-hippie period, one took wisdom wherever one could get it, which meant that one also couldn't ignore the Gospel of St. John 1:1. This, of course, tells how in the beginning there had been the Word. Presumably, if there had been the Word, one should try to listen to it. He didn't say, "In the beginning there was the color." Moving to a new center a few weeks later was helpful on several counts. For one thing, I did not have to spend a lot of spare time or energy. Several periods of meditation each day, several hours of physical work, regular, obligatory meal prep and cleanup, these together could leave a person feeling exhausted. I had to get to know the names and personal habits of about 50 new housemates, and at the same time feel into the impersonal, inflexible rhythms of Zen life. As well, I could detect an atmosphere of suspicion about the value of book learning. Maybe this wasn't exactly against study. Maybe it was just that that kind of thing had lower priority. The founder here, Suzuki Roshi, had liked work, physical work, cleaning things, ordering things, moving things. This emphasis was taken up, perhaps intensified by some of his senior students. Study period was a thing, yes, especially at the monastery. But when it was over, you were supposed to drop it and get on with the next activity. That was study. This was something else. One of the worst slurs you could speak about something someone said was to call it an idea or a concept. That's just your idea. Most everyone understood, though, that at least some of the time ideas were okay. A person did have to think. You might have to plan or to inform yourself. You were supposed to know about and appreciate your lineage, for example. What you weren't supposed to do, as far as I could tell, was to let yourself be run around by the thinking mind, You weren't supposed to get hooked by an idea. If you did, there would be no more free functioning, a vaunted quality of the enlightened state, compared to a fish moving at ease in open water. You'd be dragged instead this way and that by the hook and line of discursive mind. From our hours in meditation, we knew this line to be nearly unbreakable. We knew the rod to be strong and inflexible. We knew the fisherman to be cunning and tireless. At some point, my fixation on hearing began to relax, for no reason apparent to me. If that monkey didn't quite leap off my back, he at least loosened his grip and slid over to make room for other monkeys. I did stay interested in the topic of listening, whatever it might be, however one might practice it, but somehow I also began to see it in a bigger context. This might have had to do with group life, with being exposed to other practices, other ways, opening up to other people's trips. And it paralleled the sutra in which other bodhisattvas speak too. More than 20 of them presented their enlightenment stories. At present, I couldn't bring to mind even one. Teachings we heard in the public lectures were largely, though not exclusively, drawn from Zen literature. While sound and hearing played a role in this enormous corpus, there were many other techniques as well. For every monk who had had his mind blown open by the sound of a pebble or bamboo, there was at least one other story in which someone whacks someone else on the head, or twists his nose, or points to the sky. There were mystical tea ladies sitting in lonely huts by distant roads, ready to pose mind-stopping questions to know-it-all pilgrims. There seemed to be a lot of ways to pay attention and wake up. If listening was a good one, maybe the best one, it was not the only one. Simply varying the pace of daily actions, for example, could force them from being unconscious events to being conscious ones. The practice of walking meditation in the Zendo was unbelievably slow. There was virtually no visible forward movement for most of the time. On the other hand, meals taken there were very brisk indeed. One waited at the beginning while being served, and one waited again at the end during cleanup and the collection of wash water. But while you were actually trying to operate the bowls and implements without catastrophe, while you were actually trying to eat some food, there was no pause at all. We had to do ordinary things, putting away dishes, or wiping down tables, or cutting vegetables, or stacking cushions, to the specifications of someone else. Working as part of a team, back then we called them crews, meant all kinds of coordination. Feedback about your work generally came in a friendly form, but not always. There was no guarantee. Especially in the kitchen, especially under time pressure, things could get terse. In an industrial kitchen, things were hot and heavy and sharp. People too. Even if you weren't following someone else's instructions, there might be a background style, some Zen way things should be done. These were often adapted from Asian traditions to current Occidental specifics. Wild and distinctly modern footwear still went in the shoe rack in a certain way. You entered certain rooms in your bell-bottoms or your short skirt or your overalls, but you went in with one particular foot, not the other one. You bowed your afroed or jufroed or ponytailed head here to that imaginary thing. You didn't bow there to the other one. Most important seemed to be that you didn't leave a trail behind you. No trace was kind of a watchword that rang with spiritual overtones. Surfaces you'd used, spaces you had occupied, these were to be left clean and unobstructed for the next person. It was more than just good institutional manners. It verged on being an embodiment of emptiness, as if no one had been there. Very tidy, Zen tidy. Given the cornucopia and variety of these mindfulness methods, it's true that the new center was organized sonically to a high degree. If you cared about listening, there was a lot to listen to. One bright bell trilled for wake-up. A knocking pattern of wood on wood called you to meditation. Bronze gongs and big drums told time. Bowl-shaped metal gongs began and ended the sitting periods. Smaller gongs, a couple sizes of them, together with stationary instruments set around the building, marked the progress of ceremonial processions. The whole day was punctuated with music. To show up, you had to listen. Matching this, perhaps the other arm of an oral embrace, was a fierce emphasis on silence. For a lot of the time, you had to be quiet. There was no need to think about what hearing or listening meant. If you didn't do it, you would get shushed fairly sternly. For banging pots in the kitchen, for clomping down the stairs too loudly, for talking too loudly or too much, or eating or laughing too loudly. Shh! As a new resident, I had been assigned the house job sweeping the front walk. I thought it meant only the front walk because even that was a fair bit of work. The center sat as the last building down a tilted block and was large enough so that it filled the space between the mid-size street in front and the narrow, shady alley behind. Sidewalk ran around 3 long sides of the building. If I was supposed to sweep it all, I'd be there hours at a time. We also sat midway down a hill, not one of San Francisco's steepest or most scenic, but with incline sufficient so that wrappers, bottles, bottle caps, crumpled papers, cans, and any flotsam from running water came down and tangled in the bit of greenery we had facing the street, which was just some ragged ivy climbing a waist-high cyclone fence. The hill seemed to pause and flatten out at our corner, allowing another slanted road to cross and descend in another direction. So, how to sweep the walk? Was there an established way? Like everyone else, I had seen pictures of the famous raked stone gardens in Japan. Did anything from that mysterious discipline apply to the 30 yards or so of sidewalk bordering Page Street? Or the 50 yards along Laguna? Or again, the 30 on Lily Alley? The only thing I could think of was because one did not see any footprints in the gravel, the raking must have been done with a pull stroke instead of a push. Parallel lines were also featured. Equipped with these fantasy tips, I set out. The tools for the sidewalk job were standard: a normal kitchen broom, such as any householder might have, an industrial push broom about 3 feet across at the bristle end, and a dustpan, also of industrial scale. The push broom, for streets or sidewalks, had very stiff bristles made of plastic. The metal dustpan, too, was intended for outdoor use only. The end that met the sidewalk was a dull blade a couple feet across. The mostly closed pan was backed with a curved handle. We did not have the model that clapped open and shut at a sweeper's whim, but ours was nevertheless impressive. It had dawned on me that the sweeping should proceed from the building where we all lived and breathed toward the street, rather than the other way around. Even so, I thought that the dirt, dust, and whatever else was not simply to be brushed over the curb and left, as if, having been forced away, it no longer had anything to do with us. It couldn't be right to simply load our mess onto someone else, even if that someone else was the city and county of San Francisco. With the house broom, I cleared a little border about 10 yards long on the inside edge of the sidewalk by the ivy. I then planted the bristles of the big broom there and pulled. I backed up a couple steps and pulled some more, repeating this until I had crossed the sidewalk. Voila! This was going to get me dirty, especially my feet in open sandals, but it seemed effective at cleaning the walk and at keeping down general pollution. This was especially true, I noticed, if I worked in longer, smoother, lower-angled strokes. Having pulled a rock garden-worthy pattern across the sidewalk for the first section, I fetched the dustpan and collected the results. Another cycle brought me to the brick front stairs. I had forgotten these, as well as the porch at their top. Maybe the stairs were someone else's job? I had only been told front walk. But I guessed, with a sense of increasing resignation, that the job meant the wide front stairs as well. It was impossible to do them just now, though, because Mrs. Suzuki, the founding abbot's widow, stood on them. Elaborately dressed in a Japanese kimono, tabi, and zoris, she rested against one of the railings, running from the sidewalk up to the columns of the porch. I don't think she was actually holding a parasol open, but if she had been, it would have been just one more element in the portrait of perfect elegance she made. I inclined my head and upper body in a bow of greeting, and she, after a pause, returned the greeting, showing me, it felt, how this was to be done. An upper body in a bow of greeting, and she, after a pause, returned the greeting, showing me, it felt, how this was to be done. As our mutual gesture ended, she indicated, was it with a glance, slightly raising a finger, or a fan, or with a tilt of her head, that she had something to say. I approached and waited. Last year, when Suzuki Roshi was sick, in bed, she indicated the apartment above the front stairs, he would hear that sweeping sound. It was his favorite sound. She nodded very slightly and blinked. Our conversation was over. I nodded back to her. I hope I bowed. I had met Suzuki Roshi a number of times. I had done meditation intensives with him, here and up in Oregon. I had heard him and watched him teach, and I'd even had snippets of conversation with him. He was like a god to me, a colossus of Zen. He was also just a short, strikingly handsome old man with a bright smile. It never occurred to me that he would have a favorite sound, but of course he did. Read by David Schneider.